what did your competitive experience in swimming bring to your CrossFit abilities? Do you feel like you had an edge on any maybe specific areas, whether it's breathing, competition experience? What did you take with you from that?
I'll say first off, it was definitely not breathing. So I think the reason I gravitated towards swimming is because as a kid, I was an asthmatic, right? I mean, I had really bad exercise-induced asthma. And one of the things that my doctor recommended was that I swim. I was like 9 years old. And I loved running. Like I ran cross country and I ran track, but man, I would have these awful asthma attacks afterward. And they recommended that I swim. And it just so happened I was a very gifted upper body pulling strength athlete as a child.
Yeah.
I set our school record for strict pull-ups at 30 in 5th grade. And you can kind of see why I gravitated towards swimming, despite the fact I'm not the tallest person in the world. I'm 5'11".
Yeah.
Just tall for a CrossFitter and very short for a swimmer. But I had a long reach and a ton of upper body pulling strength. So I kind of, that got built more through swimming, but it definitely wasn't breathing. And then I swam the shortest events that were available in the sport. So I didn't really have much endurance carryover to the sport of CrossFit. In fact, my endurance capacity now far exceeds my endurance capacity when I was a competitive swimmer. I literally was a specialist in an event that took 19 seconds. So some of the things that I was particularly good at first getting into CrossFit, upper body pulling, the first time someone showed me a muscle up, I did a muscle up. They were like, "Can you do muscle ups?" I was like, "I don't know what that is." And they did one and I was like, "Yeah, I can do that." Like, yes, for sure I can do that. Learning butterfly pull-ups was like a snap because it felt like swimming butterfly. Like it was literally just the same movement pattern. And then the other thing is like rowing metrics. My 500-meter row, the first time I got on a rower, it was 120. So like I had a
first time.
Yeah, I had a lot of power coming into the sport. Same thing's true with like assault bike metrics. I think back when they first released the assault bike, we were doing aerodyne work, I would always turn in really impressive, like 30-second max calorie scores or 1 minute max calorie scores. But some of that power now is faded. I've kind of trained the power out of myself as I've gotten deeper into CrossFit and become a little more enduring. But yeah, I think that I also had some massive holes. Like swimming left me with like really, despite the fact that I squatted and, strong coming into the sport, and I did a lot of plyometrics, my ankles were stiff, my hips were tight, like all the classic things that you get from swimming for 15 years competitively.
Yeah. So is that something that goes into maybe swimmers' general preparation, or some of the aspects that you didn't train when you were younger, the squatting, maybe some running as well, some sprinting? Is that now maybe more popular, let's say, in the realm of swimmers?
That's hard to say. So I still think there's this resistance in the swim community to adopting, we'll just call it more functional training. Like I think there's, or more diverse dryland training. It's happening. It's more of a top-down approach where the elite athletes, they get exposed to these elements like squatting, lunging, plyometrics and things like that. And they recognize the value. And now it's starting to trickle down to more of the age group programs and things like that. But I mean, I was actually just having a conversation recently with someone who swims at the high school that my daughter will go to eventually. And they said that team does not use any dryland. They quote, "don't believe in dryland." Like it's something that you can or cannot, like it's something that you cannot believe in. I laughed so hard. It's like, clearly they have no exposure to what high level swim training looks like. That was part of what I did at Swim at Carolina, was work with, the dryland for not the top tier, but the guys that were Olympians, but like not the top tier. And we did dryland like crazy. I mean, these guys were crushing it. Sleds, sledgehammers, plyos, RLE split squats with a pair of 100-pound kettlebells. I mean, these dudes were getting strong. And their starts were off the charts better than most of the athletes. Cause back then, that was 2011, 2012. There wasn't a lot of functional training going on in swimming. It was a lot of like core stuff, people getting on the stability balls and like rolling around, and, Dara Torres popularizing Pilates and stuff for swimming. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but if you want to get off the blocks, Pilates isn't going to do it.
No, that's a good point. So maybe for those who aren't that familiar with, swimming and swim training, what proportion of training does Dryland training take for swimmers at this point in time, or at least for the athletes that you coach?
Well, during COVID lockdown, it was 100% because everyone was locked out of the pools. So actually, one of my good friends, Dan Jackson, who's a swim coach here in Atlanta, he and I, we would consult quite a bit during COVID, and man, he was training some of those athletes and basically just he's a skier, salt bike, and rower for their conditioning work. And then he was, taking them through some pretty, you would look at it and be like, man, there's some elements of CrossFit. There's some elements of functional training, some elements of plyometrics. When those guys got back in the water, they all said, like, my legs feel so good. Your legs die, especially some of these guys were like 800 milers, and your legs just get gassed swimming because they're hard to train in the pool. They use up a lot of your oxygen. They use up a lot of your energy when you're swimming, and they don't give you a lot of propulsion back. And so I think part of what happened for these guys during that little period of time, that COVID period of time, is they built a lot of capacity, a lot of oxygen utilization and delivery in their legs. And the result has been they've gotten back in the water and they're like, man, my legs feel good. But yeah, I think it depends on the events the athlete specializes in. I think your sprinters are going to spend a lot more time on land building, building tissue, because let's face it, power output has a decent correlation back to tissue size, to muscle size, to learning to get off the blocks, learning to be a little bit more explosive. And then learning to apply. And then what they do in the water, they even do resistance training in the water, right? Resistant bands. They've got these cool devices called the power rack, which is basically like a pulley system that lifts weights and attached to a belt, it lifts weights as you go. So learning to apply the strength they're building on land back into the water.
Yeah, it's interesting what you mentioned about the legs and maybe the concept of strength reserve that we talk about in other sports for other physical qualities, like a speed reserve, for example, for a rugby player or a soccer player. And now you're bringing that into the pool, where maybe people could think that there might not be transfer because of, the specificity or lack thereof. But we are seeing, like you're saying, people see that, and athletes feel like they are, more resilient. They can last longer and their legs get less tired simply by that, heightened capacity and strength in their legs.
I think there's something to be said for changing the way an athlete feels, especially in swimming, where so much of it is tactile based, right? I mean, the water creates such a powerful tactile stimulus where you feel contact everywhere on your entire body the entire time. I mean, so swimming's very different than other sports in that regard, that you're very like sensory oriented as you're swimming. And I think that getting people to feel good in the water, especially higher level swimmers, is like part of the art of being a good, successful swim coach.
Just out of curiosity, how aware are you during a race of your competitors left and right in the pool?
I would say hyper aware, in the sense that, like, any sprinter, like if you talk to 100 meter or a 200 meter guy, they would be able to tell you, like, to a T what was going on around them at any moment, because that race, which lasts, a 200 meter lasts 20 seconds, a 50 freestyle, depending on yards or meters, is going to be anywhere between 19 and 22, 23 seconds. That span of time is so dilated in your experience that it feels like, minutes of your life have passed in 22, 23 seconds. And so I think there's a lot of sensory information that's captured during that time. You're very well aware when in a 50 meter freestyle, when someone passes you, you're very aware of it. Or you can tell when someone's sitting at your shoulder and you've got the race locked up. And there's nothing you can do about it because you're at 100% effort. There's no changing the result of the race at that point. You can't alter your mechanics or increase your tempo because you're already there, but you're very aware of where everyone is at that time. I mean, I remember there's this one race. I don't know why this one sticks out to me, but there was this turn and I miffed the turn. Like I came in, I hit, and I planted my feet just a little too high on the wall. And if you plant your feet too high on the wall, biomechanically, you're going deep, right? So if your feet are high, you're going to push off, you're going to go really deep. And I remember that a turn takes like 0.6 of a second. And that, I mean, the number of thoughts that went through my head in that 0.6 of a second is unreal. It's like, oh man, that was a perfect turn. Oh no, your feet were too high. You're going to go too deep. Like all of that happened in point like that.
You talked about the sensory information of being in the water. For maybe those of us that aren't real fish and that don't have really good swimming technique, what does it feel like to put out a max effort on a short distance like that, swimming in the pool? How does it compare to, an assault bike sprint or a rower sprint?
That's such a good question. So first off, I think one of the cool things I got to do when I was in graduate school is I got to use this device. And it basically was like, it was the equivalent of an erg for swimming, except that you were swimming in the pool. So it could measure power output directly as you swam against it. And some of the highest wattages we ever saw were like 600, 700 watts, right? And if you just compare that back to a rower, you put that same athlete in the rower, they're going to pull, probably close to 1,000, 1,200 watts. You put on the assault bike, they're going to crank off, 2,000 plus. If you take an elite level sprint swimmer, you put them on a Wingate, you might see well into the high 2000s. So it's hard, it's challenging, but it's not the same level of power output that you feel doing a 30-second max calorie assault bike, right? So there's a big difference there. But the one thing that you do have is you have the breath hold component. And the breath hold component makes everything feel exponentially harder. I mean, people that are listening, if you want to experience what it feels like to swim a 50 freestyle, get on the assault bike and ride for 20 seconds at 75% of your max wattage and hold your breath the whole time. And then tell me how you feel when you get done. Disclaimer, don't do that if you have any health concerns. And make sure you've got a spotter.
That's definitely the intro of the podcast right there.
Yeah, but to be honest, that's a great way to explain the difference. Like your power output's not as high as it could be, right? Because you just can't, the crazy thing about swimming is if you try harder, you don't necessarily go faster, right? Trying harder just means your hands are slipping backwards in the water relative to your body. So you're not propelling yourself forward any faster. And so it's like you're in this weird dance where you can't go at max effort, but it feels terrible because of the breath hold.
Right. As a sprinter in the water, how much emphasis did you put on the respiratory system as such to develop that lung capacity, maybe be able to hold as much air in as you go along and, try to, maybe fill up that tank as much as you can before you go into that breath hold?
So I'd say this is an area of frustration of mine in hindsight, because it's something that when I would talk to my graduate advisors, I would say, man, I'm really interested in the effect of hyperventilation on breath hold times and, swimming performance. So like, that's a dead end. Don't worry about the respiratory system, worry about the cardiac system, worry about this was what, 2004, 5, 6, that range. And man, I'm so frustrated now knowing what I know about the respiratory system and how much we can influence like CO2 tolerance, breath hold retention times with hyperventilation and things like that. Like I really think that we could have changed the way people felt in their races. It may not have changed their ability to produce power, but it would have changed the sensation of breathlessness that they experienced, which, let's face it, that creates tension. When you're resisting the reflexive gulps to take a breath so that you can finish your race without lifting your head, like that impacts your stroke mechanics and it impacts your power output. It impacts your desire to do that race again in 6 hours for finals, So I would just say that I don't think there was as much of an emphasis on building good breathing mechanics, improving CO2 tolerance, using tools and tricks like hyperventilation and things like that in order to improve performance, just because there wasn't a lot of information on it at the time. People hadn't really invested. The book Oxygen Advantage hadn't come out. You know what I mean? Like it hadn't become a popularized topic at that point. And so people just weren't that interested in in breathing. Remember, because performance is never limited by uptake of oxygen from the lungs. Remember?
Yeah.
I was told that. That was beat into my head.